It was 3:47 a.m. when a plane took off from Tinian Island. The machine flew for several hours through a pitch black and stormy sky, with nothing but a dark body of water underneath it. By the time the plane had reached Yakushima, the flying machine, its passengers, and cargo had spent more than 6 hours above Earth and 2,387 kilometers in the skies. Dawn had long arrived, exposing the Earth's atmosphere and planet's surface to the human eye. The air had turned from black to blue, the clouds from gray-blue to gray-white, allowing for easier human navigation of the planet's sky by visual measurements of the planet below it. It was 9:55 a.m. when the ocean beneath the plane slowly began to make space for land. The plane began its descent from the skies again, to touch ground and take a breather on this foreign, now occupied soil, before returning hours later, rested and refueled, in the company of a second foreign plane, back into the equally foreign sky again. Together, they soon disappeared behind a thick wall of clouds. The machines took direction towards what seemed their final destination. Somewhere in the far distance, outside of the human eye, somewhere behind the sea of pillowy clouds. It was 10:45 a.m. when almost 10 kilometers above Kokura, a human settlement of 170,000, two planes had suddenly appeared, carefully searching for something unbeknown to those on the ground. But little was to be seen of both, the machine in the sky or the city's veins on the ground. While the plane's altitude initially left the machine difficult to be identified by the humans on the ground, its shadows so diffused that the air simply washed them out, for the plane to deceive the organic eye, to disappear entirely from its radar, wasn't it for that one matter, the very material of the plane's body, aluminium, which held the capacity to reflect sunlight back onto the ground, reluctantly exposing its own artificial, shiny presence within these skies. On this fateful day, however, the skies above Kokura were anything but clear. The sun was out of sight, and so was the city for the pilots. Kokura's silhouette was reported by the pilots to have been obscured by a heavy haze and smoke, which effectively created a hovering blanket that hid the city's rooftops and the heads of all its living beings from the pilot's sides. The clouds stood in between the plane and its target, forming a visual barrier and protective shield for the people and the infrastructure below it. As a result, the precision attack planned for the city's military facilities was difficult to realize. When local air defense had finally identified the planes, the two flying machines were forced to move on without completing the mission by dropping the secret and expensive cargo upon the unassuming city and its many residents. Kokura was effectively spared a second sun and, without knowing, gifted a second life instead. At noon, the nearby city of Nagasaki turned out to be less lucky than Kokura. Though covered by a thick landscape of clouds, the urban hub of more than 260,000 humans and an unknown number of animals was blinded by a device which exploded 500 meters above the city skyline. The pilots of the two planes, which had minutes before arrived from Kokura, were reported to have seen a hole in a cloud, which exposed the city to their eyes when they made that fateful decision to throw their lethal cargo intended for another city in the direction of this unfortunate metropolis. Kokura's last-minute escape turned into Nagasaki's death sentence. Within seconds, the clouds and sun above the city had vanished. The city, and the sky as we know it, had disappeared. It was replaced by an unbearable bright light that was impossible to look at, and equally impossible to ignore and run away from. A light and heat dome had been placed on top of the city, trapping everyone from above. The temperature within this dome rose within just a few seconds, from a late summery 28 degrees to above 7,000 degrees, higher than the sun's surface temperature, turning everything in its reach into dust, before releasing this dust into the air, throwing remains of soil, debris and tissues, land, homes and bodies upwards into the heavens to form a pillar of destruction that continued to climb 4 kilometers into the sky, upwards towards the goddesses, towards the heavens, before spreading out to form a cloud tree that eventually poured downwards in the form of black rain again, to destroy whatever had survived the first wave of destruction. Death was pouring from the skies. By the time the 2 foreign planes that had caused the misery had long left the crime scene, residents in Kokura could minutes later hear and see, in the distance, a demon rising in between mountains into the skies.
One government tactic, they say, was to follow each shell with a second delayed one, so that anyone who helped the injured risked being hit themselves by the second shell.
காயப்பட்ட ஆக்களை பார்த்து கொண்டிருக்க ஒரு 10 நிமிஷத்தால அதுலயே வந்து விழுந்து சரி. அப்ப அந்த காயப்பட்ட ஆக்களை ஒரு அரை மணி தியானம் அப்படி கழிச்சுதான் போய் தூக்கலாம். அப்ப அதுக்கிடையில ரத்தம் போய் அரைவாசி ஜனம் செத்துடும்.
For those who had seen loved ones die in front of them, like these girls, the agony of not being allowed to leave their bunker was unbearable. For others, like these men, their loss seemed to blind them to the danger of further attack.
Europeans' eager and often violent study of birds, insects and plants from across the colonized world didn't allow for them to change the anatomy of the European human, to enable them to effortlessly lift their own bodies into the skies, just as birds, insects and plants do. Stuck within the boundaries of their own mortal vessels, the human never succeeded in training their own bodies to fly. Instead, they learned to build machines that compensated for their own bodily limits by mimicking the aerodynamic and anatomic qualities of other living beings. This, in return, allowed them to board these flying machines that were not just able to carry their own body weights, but also those of its passengers into the skies. These new vehicles were designed and engineered as human interpretations of different natures, with materials plundered from different forests, hills and soils that were then abstracted and reconfigured into what became known as modern planes. With their ascent into the skies, Europeans didn't just take grounded bodies to the skies, but also kidnapped and transported parts of the very soils and waters they occupied and violated into the air, overturning yet another ecosystem to create a new order and future for and in the skies. The invention of the plane allowed for the very last sphere of the planet that had remained largely untouched by Europeans to suddenly be in their arm's reach. It allowed them to bypass the boundaries of gravity that for millennia kept them grounded, and the skies, safe from the brutal violence and shameless claims they had flooded the lands and waters of this planet with. Up until then, the skies were no more than a constant companion of humans, always present, but similarly always out of reach. They were the prerogative of birds, insects, winds, clouds, the sun, and the moon, where humans turned their heads towards to lose their gaze and thoughts in, where they looked towards to predict the weather, where they reached their hands towards to gain a more appropriate understanding for the actual scale of their own bodies and limited existence. The sky was a window where humans watched clouds form, gather, and move above and past them, sometimes rain, thunder, or storm down on them, where clouds alternatively retreated from to reveal a supposedly blue sky to the human eye. For humans, the sky effectively became the place where weather originates from and becomes legible at, where they look towards to predict a tomorrow, where the future materializes. For many, the sky became central to their respective cosmological orders, a mystical and holy place, where the goddesses and heavens reside, where the dead ascend towards, where relief from this earth was to be found, where effectively earthly and human rule ends, where weather was the goddesses' curses and blessings for earthlings. But this was to change. Europe's ascent to the sky was more than an innovation. It was the beginning of yet another form of subjugation, or differently put, colonization. Though climate and weather formations in the sky were never autonomous from the very conditions of the earth below it, and humans were exempted from this very natural relationship, European industrialization, urbanization, and colonization tremendously increased human capacities to negatively impact temperatures, cloud formations, rainfalls, wind strength, and thunder appearances. The genocide of indigenous people and destruction of entire landscapes across Abya Yala by Europeans, for instance, led to the collapse of entire pre-European ecosystems. This resulted in a virtual drop in global temperatures that was felt all the way in distant Europe, where the atrocities of their relatives in the colonies negatively impacted their own harvests. Industrialization in Europe, on the other hand, didn't just cause an increase in carbon emissions, but has also led to the expansion of modern cities, following mass migration of workers towards where modern factories were congregating. These cities trapped heat differently than their surroundings and were prone to produce more overcast skies, creating a distinct microclimate that was entirely of human making. While the clouds over Europe and its many settler colonial cities thickened, rendering it difficult for the European city population to see beyond this white and grey blanket above their heads, their new aerial technologies, however, allowed them to surpass these floating landscapes, to pierce through them and subjugate them, to fly above these very clouds and look down with pride, awe, and horror at the earth-altering effects their own presence has had on the environment and the planet we have inherited. Europe's growing army of planes allowed them to consolidate their existing and mostly contested claims over the lands and waters of this vast planet, to weaponize the sky and to terrorize the land, to throw violence into the air and render the skies into the extension of the horrors of the earth. The human in the sky didn't just turn into the human mimicking birds, but the human playing gods. Similar as in the colonies, the European human, albeit a new arrival, was quick to naturalize their own artificial presence within these new geographies and displace all that was before, all for whom the sky was home and refuge, who now found themselves in the way of Europe's never-ending expansion. And so, Europe's artificial birds were rising higher and higher to look further and further and capture all that was to fall within their greedy eyes and tongues.
شايف هاي ورا واحد نزل. ايوه طبعا.
Humans' use of smoke in human warfare dates back several centuries, if not even longer. Produced by burning wood, smoke was primarily used in wars as a trap for enemies or as a tool to push them out of potential hiding spots. But with the world's first aerial bombing in Libya in 1911, wars were increasingly catapulted from the ground to the sky. This produced entirely new realities and dilemmas for those on the ground, who, besides from land and sea, were now also vulnerable from that endless, translucent, and permeable landscape above their heads. While Europeans' first aerial bombardments were largely concentrated in their colonies, where they had little care for the toll of their own atrocities, it didn't take long for Europe's growing number of deathbirds to return home from their foreign endeavors, where they were soon to apply their learnings locally. This was to cause outrage amongst its public, but not because Europeans wanted these weapons to be abolished. Europeans didn't agree for their land and people to be their victims, for this European violence to finally return home. Europe's flying war machines challenged the spatial relationships of the metropolis inhabitants, their built environments, their artificial gardens, and their feelings of safety. To respond to this ever-changing nature of Europe's imperial warfare, Germans were one of the first to find an effective solution. By generating artificial smoke, Germans succeeded in obstructing their enemy's warplanes. This modern repurposing of smoke clouds was used for the first time in 1916, 5 years after the first aerial bombardment in Libya, when pyrotechnic smokescreens obscured pilots' visuals and rendered aerial attacks difficult to almost impossible to conduct for their enemies. But Germany wasn't alone in the search for the weaponization of weather for imperial warfare. During that same year, Britain too was heavily invested in the production of artificial clouds to confuse German warplanes. Their efforts, arguably more sophisticated than those of the Germans, nonetheless failed early on. This didn't bring an end to the military study of clouds. It did the opposite. Europeans' thirst for mimicking nature became insatiable. Government research programs were set up across the European world, exploring on state order the possibilities to control different weather phenomena, to advance national, military, economic, and political state interests. This fell in line with other imperial engineering efforts that have violently changed this planet's surface and our understanding as well as concept of nature. Just as European roads and railways have fragmented landscapes, buried and suffocated entire ecosystems underneath them, while equally limiting many other species' ability to move and migrate across these very roads and railways. Just as forests and jungles were entirely turned into graveyards before sometimes being rebuilt by Europeans as gardens, unfit for anyone and anything organic, but Europe's unnatural growth. Just as rivers were forced to bend to Europeans' wills, to be streamlined to the benefit of imperial economies, sometimes even changed in the very direction of flow. Just as oceans were forcefully connected by Europeans where they were separated by nature, to serve nothing but the exploitation of far-off people's labor. So too was the sky soon to become Europe's new nightmarish playground. The heavens and the weather were to fall victim to the lunacy that replaced cohabitation for supremacy, nature for artificiality, symbiosis for extractivism. Smoke screens, far larger than those from 1916, were later, in the 1940s, used across London to protect vulnerable and significant military and economic sites from advanced German aerial bombardments. This was replicated in 1945, thousands of kilometers away, when technicians of an electronic power plant in Kokura in Japan claimed to have released steam to confuse the two atomic bombers above their skies, to force them to abandon their mission and depart for another city's destruction. But this claim continues to be debated, even 79 years later. Questions on why the sky above Kokura was unexpectedly hazy during that summery midday, and why Nagasaki was hastily decimated instead, exemplify how humans have effectively blurred horizontality and verticality, how difficult to impossible it can be for the human eye to distinguish between nature or human-produced, and how humans have violently inserted themselves into the art of world destruction that is simultaneously also the art of world making. In another part of the world, where Europe wasn't meant to be, but forcefully cloned itself onto, the settler colony of the so-called United States, first attempts to manipulate clouds were already made in the late so-called 19th century. By shocking clouds with explosives deployed against, or rather shot right into them, rain-making was invented by European settlers as a means to control this foreign, to them, still largely unknown land and its related weather. By taking charge of its weather, settlers aimed to solidify their illegal control and exploitation of this occupied land, to subdue the land by subduing its skies. This effort to produce designer weather, or alternatively, weather on demand, was one of many human efforts used to manage and anticipate precipitation better, as well as to combat drought for better land exploitation. Weather control soon turned into cloud seeding, a practice in which silver in the form of silver iodides is infused into clouds, causing crystals to form and water to condense into rain, or alternatively, snow. Extracted in large amounts from their colonies, these minerals were shot by settlers into these clouds to overturn and confuse a natural order and render it into yet another human-made quasi-nature. Though cloud seeding is today most commonly associated with supposedly civil activities, such as the clearing of fogs at airports, the fighting of forest fires, the weakening of hurricanes, or the diversion of rain on national or other holidays, such as the launch of mass events, this geoengineering technique like all technologies, has a long military history. Please imagine a world in which the Russians can control weather in a big scale, where they can change the rainfall over Russia that might very well influence the rainfall in our own country in an adverse manner, were the words of bomb scientist Edward Teller in 1957 at a hearing in front of so-called US-American Military Committee. The race to control weather was one that united many empires, particularly those of European descent and belief system. It pushed them into their research labs and skies to manipulate what used to be outside of their control, outside of their arm's reach. But where the modern human thought to be God and to be in full control of nature, the limits of such arrogance showed when unanticipated side effects relegated the modern human back into their place on this planet, back into the environment they belonged to, but tried to escape from. The urge for human, national, and racial supremacy of Europeans, however, led them to dismiss the seemingly clear warnings of nature, to continue to return into the skies again and again, in the vain hope to one day be able to understand, control, and use nature's weather in their own favor. During the American war in Vietnam, cloud seeding was for the first time, at least according to officially known records, applied as a weapon of war against enemy forces on enemy territory. Operation Popeye lasted 5 years and involved several thousands of settler soldiers who were instructed to shoot minerals into the skies of today's Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. So to manipulate the monsoon season, change the rain's direction, and extend its very duration. This violent intervention was to undermine the military advances and rearming efforts of the Viet Cong. By undercutting their war mobilization through the instrumentalization of heavy rainfalls, it aimed to harm the supply infrastructure. The Viet Cong were to be thrown back in time and space and forced into defeat. These weather manipulations lasted for the entirety of 5 years, in which an overall increase of 30% more rainfall was accounted for in this region. This infamous military operation, built on years of experiments and knowledge gained from studying and manipulating hurricanes on Pacific island colonies and on the colonial mainland, was then used where it served US war interests. In the aftermath of this brutal decimation campaign, the focus of research and debates was on how the land of this region were heavily infected with lethal chemicals and explosives by the European settler state. But very little attention continues to be paid to how the skies above this land were equally chemically altered. The full effects of the sky and earth-shattering violence remains, up until today, largely understudied. And yet, despite the many uncertainties connected to cloud seeding and geoengineering, this practice has over the decades shifted to become a global formula to push the growth of national economies. It is used as a symbol of progress as well as state control, and is today aspired to by new empires. Today, it isn't the European settler colony, but China that has become the world leader in cloud seeding. Only a few years ago, the empire has announced to expand its own cloud seeding efforts across a territory the size of 5.5 million square kilometers, a territory 1.5 times larger than India. This ambitious effort promises to improve precipitation in China's dry northern provinces, but is also heavily contested by neighboring India and Nepal, who fear detrimental effects for their own natures, for the rains to disappear from their own skies. Indeed, the weather wars Europeans and their settler relatives were anticipating in the 1950s have already begun. Today, the only difference is that it's no more just Europeans and their many satellite states who are heavily invested in manipulating weather in their own favor, but anyone who has subscribed and pledged allegiance to these nightmarish ideologies Europeans have cursed this planet with, to the nightmare or sky-shattering thunder that is colonial modernity.
Speed 95 attitude 190 Speed 100 attitude 200 Speed 100 attitude 210
We live under the same sky, we are told. But do we really gaze at the same blue? Is the cloud you see the cloud I see? Is the sky you smile towards the same sky others seek shelter from? Is the humming in the air that of a bird? And is the bird even a bird anymore? When you watch the sky, what do you see? And who do you not see? Whose histories do the heavens hold? And whose do they destroy?